朋友们，大家好，欢迎来到瑞视频，我是 Jennifer。美国少数族裔媒体服务中心召开线上研讨会，现在请看来自美国新闻速递的详细报道。
And today, Los Angeles Unified Schools opened with 97% of all students coming back. And so we know that this is a scary time given what's happening with the variant, but there are safety measures and COVID mitigation measures that we believe that can make it possible for our students to have in-person instruction. Obviously, the state does allow some independent study for those students who have a medical necessity or need to have some alternative to in-person instruction. But we've learned that our students need in-person instruction, that they've suffered the lack of access to educators and peers. And we know that mental health needs have grown and that our learning gaps have been exacerbated. And so while we continue to navigate COVID-19 and the Delta variant, we know that we can deliver on providing a great education to our students. I was very pleased today to start the day with the students at Gala, an all-girls school where students are getting access to math and science to prepare them for great futures. Many of the students of color, low-income students, and so I'm mindful of our families who are skeptical, who are scared. I think it's okay to be scared, but let that fear translate into action that will ensure that our students can get an education and that we can keep them and their family members and their educators safe. That starts with vaccines. And I just want to continue to remind everyone that it's not too late to get a vaccine. I want to acknowledge and congratulate Californians. Californians have availed themselves to getting a vaccine more than residents of any other state. That's great work right there. But let's not stop there. There are still many who can and must get a vaccine. And if for no other reason, to get a vaccine for those young children below the age of 12 who cannot get one until we have FDA approvals, maybe later this year. In the meantime, what we're seeing is that this is turning into a crisis of the unvaccinated. What we're seeing is that 99% of those who are experiencing serious complications from COVID, including hospitalizations and sadly death, are those who have not been vaccinated. I can't think of a more compelling reason to urge everyone who can to get a vaccine than that. 99% of those experiencing the most complications are those without a vaccine. You know, I'm a parent first and foremost. Both of my teenage children, they attend public schools. They've gotten their vaccines. You know, my kids are back in school. And so I just want to also let those folks who are watching, the parents, know that I share your concerns, but I believe that this can be done if we follow the various measures that we've been given. We know that vaccines are a big part of the question, masking for all of our students and staff on school campuses, and using regular COVID tests. In the weeks leading up to the opening of schools, our office has continued to push on our message about the importance of vaccinations. Just last week, we reached out to 500,000 California households in multiple languages to make sure that families know about the availability of vaccines, that they're free, that it doesn't hurt, that you don't have to have health insurance, and that the vaccines, while new to most of us, they're not new to the scientists. This is not an overnight development, but something that has been researched for many, many years and thankfully is available to help us. I want to also let families know that the California state legislature, the governor, and my office, we've all worked together to get record number of resources available to our students to have counseling in school. We recognize that many students have experienced the trauma of the pandemic. And so billions being provided for counseling. More than $4 billion available for mental health services for young people from ages of birth to the age of 25. More than $3 billion for community schools so that you have wraparound supports, health and mental health, and also supporting families. Billions spent so that we have a thing called universal meals. That means that any student who wants a meal can get a meal regardless of their background, regardless of income, no need to have a lot of paperwork. We have universal transitional kindergarten for every 4-year-old. That means that we recognize that many students haven't had access to being on a campus, and now there's universal transitional kindergarten for our kids, including more subsidized programs in childcare for our very young children to be able to get what they need. There's so many mitigation measures I want to tell you about. We've given money to our schools to support outdoor classrooms, air purification systems, and air filtration, improving ventilation, making sure that there's PPE. We're working on everything to support the mental well-being of our students, their physical safety, and of course, what we call the acceleration of learning. That just means that we want to recognize that many of our students suffered during the pandemic, and that learning gaps that we were working to close were exacerbated during the pandemic. We had 1 million students when we started this who did not have access to a computer. We still have 1 million students in the state who do not have access to high-speed internet. And so to offset those learning gaps, schools have money for programs like literacy, more tutoring, professional development, hiring more one-on-ones to work with students, whether it be in special education or after school, more significant investments made in special education. You know, this is the most thoughtful and robust budget we've seen for California education in decades, upwards of $120 billion to support every aspect of supporting our school communities that you can imagine. During the pandemic, I launched a new initiative called Education to End Hate, providing implicit bias training to educators in our schools. We've seen the spike in hate against our Asian American and Pacific Islander families. We've seen the mistreatment of immigrant children and unaccompanied minors. And so we are sending a message by talking about ethnic studies. During the pandemic, we created a new guide for how school districts can create their own ethnic studies curriculum. So students of color can learn about the contributions of their ancestors to make this a great state. And of course, there's legislation still being heard that might create an ethnic studies graduation requirement. All these things we're putting together to find ways to grow from these ashes to support an education system that does a better job of supporting our 6 million students. Raymond, we were heartbroken to see the crimes that have taken place against many in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And my office has brought leaders together to talk about ways to encourage partnership and to ensure safety for our schools. We're working with leaders who've created curriculum to teach about the contributions of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in our communities. Our ethnic studies model curriculum talks about the contributions of Asian American and Pacific Islanders to make California a great state. And our Education to End Hate initiative has sent grants directly to school districts to provide training to counter any idea of bias, hate, or racism against any group, including our partners in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities. I would just say that any parent, if you think that anything is happening to address your child, please contact your school district immediately. But again, we're working closely with our educators to support our students. We've even created a statewide youth advisory council where young people, students, can help us lead in conversations about how to get past hate, how to get past bias, and how to create mutual understanding for supporting all of our students. Unfortunately, we've lived in a time when the pandemic has started where a culture of blame has been inappropriately attributed to some of our students, including Asian American and Pacific Islander students. We have to debunk any myths and flat out lies that have come from people like former President Trump and anyone else in any way who have equated anything about the coronavirus with our Asian American Pacific Islander families. It's just flat out not true. And we've been busy doing our part to educate our partners and again, to address any issues of bias that exist to make sure that our schools are safe. We have more counseling programs set up for our schools, more restorative justice programs set up for our schools, more community schools themselves. And we will work closely with our education leaders to help keep our schools safe for all of our students. Again, any families who feel like there's any danger at all, please contact your schools immediately, and we'll do our part to assist them as well.